All right. We are good to go. We should be live now. You guys should hear me okay. See, the mic is picking up. Drinking some warm tea for my throat. We'll see how that goes. That was a little rough last time. All right. Well, good evening, everybody. If you're watching this live or recorded, doesn't matter. This is Stygian Articles presented by the Lovecraft Tapes podcast, and we welcome you. I am Jeremy, your keeper of arcane lore, and tonight I'm going to read some horror fiction for you. Listener discretion is advised, as always. The scary stories I read and write will sometimes contain extreme horror, violence, language, and other adult themes. Watch and listen at your own risk. And tonight we're going to be reading part 2, the second half of Ghosts in Okemos, a longer short story that I wrote a while back as part of the Sheila Helsing Chronicles. And we'll see how this goes. Hope you enjoyed the first half. I did not encounter a ghost there, unfortunately. Yeah, they're hard to come by these days in Okemos. If you did miss the first part, you can go back to youtube.com/Lovecraft Tapes, and you can find the first part of it, catch up with that, and then finish here later on if you need to. But otherwise, we're going to jump straight into it. So far, the facts turned up in Sheila's investigation of the events at the Okemos jailhouse pointed toward a malicious haunting. They were rare, and she hadn't encountered one in a long while. So, what had triggered it? Usually, ghosts didn't turn on the living unbidden. There had to be some catalyst. She tried to imagine what Deputy Sam Randall had gone through. What had he seen that was so terrible he'd reached in with his fingernails and clawed out his own eyes? Sure, he'd been receptive to just about anything the entity might show him. All that reading up on poltergeists and other phenomena. Old Sammy had been ripe for plucking, so to speak. Sheriff Riggs seemed like a straightforward guy. No bullshit there. The man clearly cared about his people and his town. Deputy Mike Carter came across as pretty decent as well. She couldn't blame him for trying to drown his memories with alcohol. Hell, she'd done the same thing years ago, trying to quell the recollection of finding her dead mother's body at the foot of the cellar stairs. It didn't work, though. Drinking never solves anything. The marble stairs into the library glowed, reflecting the cloud-filtered sunlight from above. A few students hung around the entry, smoking cigarettes and talking quietly, backpacks heavy with knowledge. Sheila felt a pang of jealousy. She remembered being carefree and thirsty for new things, eager to fill her brain with facts and data, hungry to engage in active discussion with other like minded people. Once you get out into the real world, though, all of that changes. No one out there wants or will abide by new ideas unless ratified by a majority. That's when you have to learn to live outside the mainstream, make your own rules, discover your own truths. Soon enough, These kids will learn that too. As always, the heavy odor of binding glue and yellowing paper hung in the air. Sheila breathed deep. It was like stepping back in time, before pollution, before the electronic age. She made her way to the history section. Because she knew this place as if it were her own, she found the references to O'Keefe immediately. As she had recalled, the man had been the mayor of Red Hook, New York, back in the late 70s. He'd ridden the conservative ticket, even flirting with anti Semitic groups and the Ku Klux Klan for votes. Hate crimes motivated by race rose during his tenure, not surprisingly. His opponents accused him of bigotry, greed, and cheating at the polls. Eventually, the charges stuck, and just before 1980 dawned, O'Keefe's enemies ousted him. Somehow, probably cashing in favors from powerful friends, he managed to become appointed as sheriff in Okemos, Michigan, when the new police station was erected. What was the connection? As nearly as she could make out, Hugh O'Keefe had no family in these parts. Okemos land had been owned by the Chippewa tribe and was, in fact, named for their chief. No connection to a corrupt politician whose roots trace back across the Atlantic. None that she could make out anyway. Despite all the hoopla in Red Hook, the new Okemos sheriff kept things quiet. No reports of any wrongdoing cropped up in the papers. For 13 years, Hugh O'Keefe seemingly served his civic duty in contentment and peace. In 1993, the mantle passed on to Riggs. After Okemos? As far as history was concerned, O'Keefe had no more parts to play. Even the newspapers held no shred of evidence, and they were rabid about keeping tabs on major losers. Of course, this happened way before media frenzy became so lucrative and fascinating to the public. Sheila checked a few directories, including the online Yellow Pages. No O'Keefes in Red Hook or in Okemos. Hugh might be dead or anywhere else. She didn't have the time to spend looking for him, in the hopes he might be able to corroborate the stories of supernatural occurrences at the local police station. She had to let that lead drop for now. Next stop, the hospital. Even though Sam might not be in any shape to talk, she had to try. Sometimes clues had to be excavated, like lost treasure from a dragon who wasn't even aware of what it was hoarding. Construction cranes loomed over the hospital. Looked like they were building another wing. Sheila shook her head as she entered the automatic doors. If sick people were business, then business was booming. Sheila Helsing? A woman in a white lab coat holding a clipboard stood near the reception desk. Blonde hair graying and ruddy skin on her thin frame bespoke either alcoholism or too much sun. Her name tag read Martha, and her blue-gray eyes sagged sadly. Yes. How did you know? The woman shifted uncomfortably, looking to the floor. Sam said you'd be here any minute. He's been waiting for you. Sheila nodded, surprised but not shocked. Today would be filled with many more surprises, she imagined. Lead the way. Martha led them through corridors where the floors shone like mirrors. Everywhere, fluorescent lighting bouncing off sanitized surfaces. Listerine and bleach competed for dominance in the air. People clothed in blue and white smocks swarmed the halls, carrying clipboards or pushing carts. Sheila imagined they were desperately trying to find that one madly beeping machine in order to still its noise for good. Each doorway they passed became a tableau of pain, sickness, and death. She felt like a purveyor of art walking the gallery. Here, a contorted face and a body pierced with tubes and wires and needles. There, a huddled flock of dark-clothed figures mourning the loss of a withered stick figure swaddled in sweat-stiffened blankets. Occasionally, a happy, hopeful face peered back at them. Finally, they reached a closed door. Sheila glanced through the tiny wire-reinforced window. A gray form reclined in bed, two circles of cotton taped over where his eyes used to be. "Before you go in," Martha said, "he may be unintelligible at times. Not surprising after such an injury. We haven't ruled out brain damage yet either. Otherwise, he's quite lucid." Sheila nodded. "I'll keep that in mind." Martha opened the door. "I'll be out here. Try not to be too long." As she slipped into the dusky room, Sheila looked around. Not much here in the way of beeping, blinking machines. A single IV drip ran into Sam's arm. Another bed sat empty across the room, its pristine sheets pulled tight and ready. A large window faced east, but the curtain had been drawn to shut out the light. "Open it if you like," Sam said, and his voice resonated deep and strong. It had a curious undercurrent of mirth, too, as if he were mocking her on some level she didn't yet understand. His face remained stoic, though. "No, I'm good," she replied, sitting in the single chair facing his bed. "Would you like it open?" He laughed abruptly, pointed at his eye patches. "I don't have much luck with windows, as you can see." Sheila took out her pad and scribbled, "Eyes equal windows to soul." He muttered something foreign under his breath. I'm sorry, what did you say?" Sheila leaned closer. Sam turned his head slightly to face her. "Did I say something? I do that sometimes. The nurses ask what I've said, but I can't remember anything. Sometimes I can taste the words, though, like rust or battery acid. They must be bad words. How long have I been here?" Sheila swallowed. "Since this morning. About 7 hours now." "Ah," Sam sighed. "It seems like forever." "Tell me about the ghosts," she said. For a few moments, the world went silent. Even the cacophony out in the halls stopped, as if a heavy blanket had been wrapped around the room. Sheila's pen hovered over her notepad expectantly. "What's the tale?" he began. "I heard noises, voices where there should be none. Little things would be displaced like books, paperweights." "Coffee cups?" she interrupted. He smiled. His teeth were pitted with cavities, stained with age. "You've been talking with Possum." "Yes, even the occasional coffee cup, Miss Helsing." He'd use the proper Ms., not Miss or Mrs., like everyone else did. She shivered. "At any rate, I started reading up on the phenomenon. I thought it was a poltergeist initially. Boy, was I wrong. This thing is evil. Had been from the get-go. I mistook its pranks for benevolence when really the entity just lacked strength. It had been growing slowly, feeding psychically on the prisoners we put in that one cell. Not too many happy meals there, I can tell you." "Wait a minute." Sheila stopped writing. "How do you know all this?" Sam grinned. "It's still in me." She stared at him. "It lured me into that cell, then possessed me," he said, pointing at his face. "Through the eyes, of course. The effort must have weakened it temporarily because, though I could feel it inside my head like some kind of sinus infection, it couldn't do much more than whisper things into my brain. Bad things. Things it would do to me, to my family and friends, to anyone who crossed its path. So I knew what to do. All that reading paid off. Plus, a little biblical background didn't hurt." Sheila felt her eyes move. Sorry. Sheila felt her lips moving of their own accord, her religious studies coming to mind. "If thine eye offends thee, pluck it out," he finished. And so I did. Both of them. Trapped the ghost inside. I had planned to finish the job with my gun, but it took hold. Wouldn't let me pull the trigger. Possum found me not too long after that. And now here we are, having this cozy little chat. All three of us. The new improved Trinity, she thought. The Father, the Daughter, and the unholy ghost. What does this ghost want? He shrugged. What does anybody want? Power, fame, fortune. And the last one can be a bitch to come by when you're in corporal. Money doesn't mean much in the afterworld. Unless you possess the living, of course, she ventured. He smiled again. Of course. Sheila drew a deep breath. You're not exactly 100% Sammy anymore, are you? Very astute, Miss Helsing. I'd say we're about 60-40 right now. And old Sammy's losing share bit by bit. He's an obstinate codger, though. Doesn't want to give up what's his, lo, these past 57 years. Can you blame him? She asked. No, the ghost agreed in a voice that wavered between Sammy's and something deeper with a kind of northeastern twang. Neither did I go easily into that not so good night. With an almost audible click, the puzzle fell together in Sheila's mind. She had her suspicions from the beginning. Now she just needed one more piece. Tell me, she said casually, read any good books back in Red Hook? Only one, he said without hesitation. One very good book. Sheila stood, packing her stuff quickly. She had to get back to Okemos. Sammy might not be saved, but if she didn't hurry, all hell would break loose, and very soon. Do me a favor, will you? He asked. Say hello to all my friends on your way out. From somewhere out in the corridor, a woman screamed. Buzzers went off. A metal tray clattered to the floor. Sheila slung her satchel over her shoulder, already racing to the door. Chaos swirled in the hospital halls. Emergency lights beamed red beacons on the ceiling, transforming the ward into some kind of weird dance club. The dancers were nurses and interns, rushing from room to room, trying to quiet the beeping instruments, occasionally bumping into each other. Martha ran to Sheila's side like an angel in a doctor's smock. She breathed raggedly and had trouble finding her words. Her sad gray eyes were wide with horror. They're moving, she gasped. Downstairs. In the morgue. Say hello to all my friends. Sheila grabbed Martha by the shoulders and looked her in the eyes. Keep everyone out of Sam Randall's room. Do you hear me? No one is to be admitted for any reason. Martha shook her head in confusion. Look, you have to trust me, Sheila said. I don't have time to explain, but Sammy is a dangerous man right now. Keep everyone out. But what about those dead people walking around downstairs? Martha's voice cracked slightly. I have an idea about that. She was already backing down the hallway, working up to a full run for the front doors. Just hold on. Sheila burst out of the hospital into twilight. Had she been in there that long? It should be hours yet before sundown. She looked back at the slowly closing doors. Strange figures, seen briefly through the gap, shuffled like overgrown ragdolls toward the exit. One of them was missing its arm. No more time for sightseeing. She hopped into the car and sped away toward Okemos. Without thinking, she turned on the radio. Several unconfirmed reports of dead people returning to life, like something out of a horror film. Sheila turned it off quickly. Right now, it didn't help matters. She stomped on the gas pedal. East Lansing flew by outside her window. In 15 minutes, she was back at the station. The sheriff met her at the door, a worried look on his weathered face and a coffee cup in his hand. You're not going to believe this, but we're getting all these weird reports, he began. She nodded. I know. Night of the Living Dead. Let's go in. The phones rang incessantly. Susie, her hair unkempt and hanging in her face, tried her best to keep up. She shot them an aggravated look when they came in. Sheila tried to give her a reassuring smile. Loud, angry, and confused voices came over the police dispatch. Riggs ignored it, sipping his coffee. We found out what happened in that cell, he said almost casually. Was it O'Keefe? She asked. He committed suicide, didn't he? The sheriff looked surprised. How did you know? Never mind. Give me the details. Sheila tossed her satchel onto an empty chair. They found him back in that same shell. They found him back in that same cell. Shot himself through the head twice. Twice? He cocked a finger and pointed at his eyes one at a time. Bang. Bang. That's not possible, she said. I know. It's bullshit, but that's what the report says. Let me see it. Riggs walked over to his desk to retrieve the file. Outside, someone ran past at a full gallop. The shadow flitted past the window, silhouetted by the street lamp outside. Full dark had descended. Here you go. He handed her a yellowed manila folder. Susie had a hell of a time finding this, almost hidden at the back of the historical records. I'm surprised they even wrote it up. Friends of O'Keefe must have covered up the whole thing. When I came on board, they said he'd already moved away to retire. Guess he retired all right. Sheila skimmed the text. O'Keefe had been working alone that night. His deputy found his body the next day in the last cell. 2 bullet wounds, 1 through each eye. 1 spent casing found underneath the bunk. 1 badly damaged bullet dug out of the wall. What about the second bullet? Never found. Assumed it remained lodged in the victim's skull. No autopsy performed. Body interred 3 days later in the local cemetery. End of report. Only 1 bullet, she whispered. What's that? Riggs asked. Nothing. Sheila closed the folder. Do you have a hammer? Yeah, I think there's one in the back utility closet. Good, she said, already moving to the back of the station. Get it and meet me back in the cell. She opened the door to the containment area. A cool, musty air breezed past her. It smelled of the past, of evil things that didn't belong in a placid place like Okemos. Hopefully she could put a stop to it. Cautiously, she approached the last cage. The eyes are windows to the soul. That's what kept coming back to her since this morning, when she first heard of Sammy's situation. Footsteps behind her. Riggs handed her a hammer. "Hope it's big enough," he said. She nodded and went into the cell, scanning the floor. While newer facilities would have poured concrete, the Okemos jail still had the original field stones. Thankfully. Otherwise, this part would be a whole lot harder. Sheila dropped to one knee, running her hand along the rough surface, looking. Her fingers hovered over one pale-looking stone. There. It seemed more well-worn than the others, a little lighter. She raised the hammer high above her head and brought it down hard. "Holy," the sheriff whispered behind her. "Not quite," she answered, "but you're getting warmer." Beneath the cracked stone, a low, hollow pit cradled a black book. No title graced its cover, but she had an inkling what it might be. It gave off menacing vibes. Had O'Keefe found it back east in a dirty bookshop somewhere hidden within the tight folds of Red Hook? She'd bet on it. "What is it?" Riggs had squatted down next to her. "It's a bad thing," she said. "It has many names. The one you may have heard is Necronomicon. But it doesn't matter what it's called. It's a vessel for evil and must be destroyed." They both looked at the book silently for a few moments. "There's a fire pit out back," he said quietly. "That'll do," she said, grabbing the thick volume and standing up. "Sooner the better." They walked past the questioning gaze of Susie without a word and out the back doors. A small patch of land behind the station held a picnic table, 2 horseshoe posts, and a stone grilling pit. Riggs went into a nearby rickety shed, returning with dry newspaper and a dented can of lighter fluid. With the practiced ease of a master griller, he got the fire going within minutes. Sheila held off throwing the book in right away. She wanted the fire good and hot. End this thing once and for all. Her fingers brushed the cover. Part of her wanted to keep the book, take it back home and study it. After all, people had killed and died for a chance to own this tome of dark knowledge. Couldn't it do some good if she wielded its power? Use the spells and incantations pressed between its yellow pages against the forces of darkness? But that shit only happened in the movies. Bad movies. She tossed the book in. No explosion, no faraway screams, no Hollywood ending. The phones inside the station, however, did stop ringing. Riggs cocked his head. "That's it? It's over?" Never that easy, she replied, and pointed to the fire. Something wriggled from between the pages of the burning book. It had once been an eye, but was now flat and desiccated, almost leached of color. She'd be willing to bet O'Keefe had shot its brethren right after he'd plucked this one out and put it in the book. And now it was trying to escape. Both of them watched. The eye tried to escape its confines, thrashing back and forth weakly above the flames. The book, though, wouldn't let go. It held its prisoner tight by the tail of the optic nerve, like a fisherman holding a tadpole. Sheila gripped the hammer tight. Eventually, any remnant of life slipped out of the eye, and it sagged against the book's bindings. The fire licked greedily at it until nothing remained except ash. The sheriff went back inside. Sheila went home. They met the next morning at the station. Riggs offered her a cup of chocolate raspberry coffee. It was a bit too sweet for her tastes, but smelled great. Mike and Susie were sorting out the previous night's reports and generally allaying the fears of the local populace. Thankfully, the governor had already been on television with some cockamamie story about radiation to explain the Walking Dead phenomenon. Not exactly re-election talk. Sam had passed away during the night. Shock and trauma, the doctor said. They'd found him, still curled up in bed, his eye sockets awash in brain blood. The sheriff looked haggard and sad. When he spoke, he sounded as though he were spitting broken glass. I've been through all this in my head. I can't make sense of it. None of it. Sheila gulped the invigorating brew, then stared into her cup. Not sure I can make you understand. Try me, please. His eyes begged for even the tiniest spark of understanding. All right, she nodded. We thought it all began with O'Keefe, and it did. This part of the story, anyway. He came to Okemos after running bad politics in Red Hook. That much I found out in the library. Ever hear of an author named H.P. Lovecraft? Riggs nodded. I think I saw a movie once with his name on it. They've adapted a few of his stories in books. One story is Red Hook, a short piece of fiction informed by Lovecraft's own experiences in New York. Well, Lovecraft was known for writing about the Necronomicon, the Book of the Dead, but they were only stories he made up, or so everyone thought. Years later, news surfaced that such a book did exist. Oh, it didn't bear a title, but the contents bore a striking resemblance to what Lovecraft had described. A magic book? He asked. She shrugged. I told you this would be hard to swallow. Go on. So, it's not a great stretch of the imagination to surmise O'Keefe got wind of this rare tome, perhaps during his political crisis. Maybe he thought it would help his career, or maybe he was a weekend cultist. Who knows? Somehow he got hold of the book. When they ran him out of town, he came to Okemos and set up shop as sheriff. Sheila took another sip of coffee. Bad move on his part. Why bad? As you and I well know, Okemos used to be indigenous American land. Now, I'm not saying the police station is built on some ancient Indian burial ground, but this is not our land. We are strangers here, have been for a long time. The sheriff looked around uneasily. Don't get too nervous, she said, and patted his hand. I think O'Keefe stirred things up when he performed his unholy ritual. You see, the eyes are the window to the soul, according to more than one Bible. The Necronomicon held an incantation to prolong life by capturing the soul and depositing it in another vessel. Sammy, he said. She nodded. Exactly. We know from the reports Susie found that O'Keefe shot himself in one eye. That happened after he plucked out his other eye, pressed it between the pages of the book, then hid it in the cell beneath that fieldstone. After he killed himself, his soul escaped into the book, waiting for a chance to inhabit another body. Crazy fucking bastard, Riggs breathed. Agreed. But it backfired somehow. I think indigenous American spirit somehow leaked into the book and tainted the spell. That sounds pretty loony, I know, but it makes the most sense. What finally got into Sammy was a mixture of O'Keefe and other ghosts. A few uncomfortable seconds ticked by. Sheila wondered if she would ever be invited back for more coffee. Riggs set his cup down and stood. I've got a couple patrols to make while these guys clean up. And then I'm going to go home to sleep for a day or two. He stuck out his hand. She took it firmly. Much obliged for the assistance. Send your bill to Susie. She'll make sure it gets paid. Sheila watched him stride away, a broken cowboy who would probably never look at the world in the same way again. Her hands curled instinctively around the mug, warming her fingertips. She wondered if this station would be safe from here on out. Maybe. Maybe not. Nothing was certain these days. And, as she well knew, there were more copies of the Necronomicon floating around out there, yearning to be found and used. Sheila stayed until her cup was emptied. Then she picked up her satchel, nodded to Mike and Susie on her way out, and drove slowly home. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed that. That was Ghosts of Okemos. Ghosts in Okemos, I should say. And this was written as a... Basically, I wanted to do a bunch of short stories with her as the protagonist. And if you've read the novel, then you kind of know the backstory about her mom and everything. And I've got a couple more of these in the pipeline in various stages of incompletion, I must say. And hopefully I can get those done at some point and put this stuff together. Yeah, so thanks for watching. Tune in next time for another installment of Stygian Articles. Thank you for spending time with me. I appreciate it. I know you got better things to do. If you've enjoyed this dark fiction, please visit StygianArticles.com for more of my scary stories and LovecraftTapes.com for fresh episodes of our Call of Cthulhu actual play podcast, which we are starting up with Case 14 next week. I'm Jeremy, your keeper of arcane lore, wishing you sweet dreams. Good night. Good night, everybody. Have a great Wednesday and rest of the week, and we'll see you tomorrow for Double Vision, believe it or not.